Okay, so now we can ask the opposite. How do you find the present value of a cash flow in the future? Okay, so now we're working with present value. Okay, again I have my timeline, time 0, time 1. This time I have a cash flow in the future, and I want to know what the present value of that cash flow is. Well, the present value of a cash flow in the future is simply the amount that you would take today instead of the promised future cash flow. And of course, if you think about it, it should be logically what you would have to have today and invest in order to get to that amount, right? In fact, we can manipulate, right? We know that future value is simply the present value compounded. So I can manipulate this formula, take this to the other side, right? So what is the present value? Well, it's simply the future value discounted, right? This is what we call discounting. So what if you will be paid $50,000 in 2 years, right? What is the amount you would be willing to accept today if your opportunity cost of capital is 5%? Right, so again, your opportunity cost is 5%. This time I have a cash flow at time 2, 50K. What is its present value? Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to discount it. Discounted for 2 periods. And that's going to give me 45.35K. In other words, a little over $45,000. Okay? I should also mention that in all these present value, future value calculations, the R that we use represents the discount rate, interest rate, opportunity cost of capital, and I use these all interchangeably. Okay, so in this lecture, you learned the concept of time value of money. This is one of the most basic concepts in finance, and it's one of the most basic tools that we use all the time. So we learned how to compute the future value of a cash flow today, and we also looked at how to find the present value of a cash flow in the future. Hello, welcome back. In this lecture, we continue our review of basic time value of money tools. This time we're going to look at how we find the future or present value of a stream of cash flows. Then we will look at the special case of a stream of even cash flows, namely annuities. But before we do any of that, let's just get warmed up with a review example from what we did last time. Suppose you would like to have $50,000 in 2 years to start your new business idea. And suppose you're impressed by your performance, your employer has just given you a bonus of $42,000 today. Now, if you can invest at 5% interest rate per year, will you have enough at the end of the 2 years to start your new business idea? Okay, so what are we trying to do here? Well, basically, right, we want to find the future value of, we have $42,000 today, and we want to know what the future value of that at 2 years from now. Right? So remember, this involves compounding over 2 years. So the interest rate is 5%. So what is the future value? Well, it's going to be 42,000 compounded over 2 years, or simply written like this, 42,000 times 1 plus the interest rate squared, which will give us 46,305, which will fall short of your target value. Okay, so I hope that reminds you of what we did last time. This was finding the future value of a value today. If we did the opposite, we would be discounting to find the present value of a future value 2 years from now. Okay? So now let's look at how we would find the future value of a stream of cash flows. So suppose over the next 4 years, you will receive the following cash flows. So here's my timeline. 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Suppose you're going to get $3,000 at the end of the first year. Suppose you'll get $2,000 at the end of the second year, $4,000 at the end of the third year, and let's suppose at the end of the fourth year you're going to get $1,000. Okay? Now, how much will you have at the end of the 4 years? All right, so I'm looking for the future value of this cash flow stream if the opportunity cost of capital, or the interest rate, is 5% per year. Okay? Well, obviously, we can't just add these cash flows, right, across from time, because they occur at different points in time. Right? They are not of the same period, basically. So what we need to do is we need to find the future value of each cash flow and then add them up. Right? So what does that mean? So we're looking for the future value at time 4. We're going to compound this for 3 periods. Right? That's going to give us 3,000 times 1 plus the interest rate to the third, plus then we're going to compound this cash flow, 2,000 times 1 plus the interest rate squared. Let me continue here. And then the next one, 4,000 compounded for 1 period. And then the last cash flow of 1,000. Right? Note that we do not compound this last cash flow because it's already at t equals 4. Right? Now, of course, we did make one big assumption, right, here, that the fact that the interest rate is, we can invest at the same rate every year, so it's constant. The interest rate is constant. Right? So that's an underlying assumption that we did, just to simplify things. All right, so now we know how to find the future value of a stream of cash flows. Okay? Now, what if all the cash flows were all the same? Right? Suppose they were all 3,000 every year across 4 years. So an even cash flow stream. Right? 3,000 every year. Okay? Well, we could do the same thing, right? We could compound each cash flow and then add them up. Right? So I'm going to compound this cash flow for 3 periods. The second one for 2 periods. The third one for one period, and then the last one. All right? But I could do better. I could actually take a shortcut, right? Let's factor out this common 3,000 that we have, right? Then what do I get? Well, I have 1.05 cubed squared 1.05 plus 1, right? Now, this thing in the brackets is what we call the annuity compound factor. Annuity compound factor. Or, short for ACF, where the parameters are the interest rate and the number of periods. Okay? So what is an annuity? Well, an annuity is a series of fixed equal payments for a specified number of periods. Right? So here we have even cash flows of 3,000 for 4 periods. Right? So there are lots of examples of annuities around you. Bond payments are examples of annuities. Your car loan payments are examples of annuities. Mortgage payments, where you have fixed cash flows, right? Fixed payments over a period. So these are all examples of annuities. And what does this annuity compound factor do? Well, it basically sums up these compounding factors for individual payments at a constant interest rate. And so what it is in general, the annuity compounding factor is 1 plus r to the n minus 1 divided by n. Okay? So that's divided by r, not n. Okay? So in general, what is the future value of an annuity where the cash flows are C dollars? The future value is going to be C dollars, the fixed payment, times the annuity compound factor. Okay? So in our example, it is V4 is 3,000 times annuity compound factor, where R is 5% and N is 4. Okay, so if you plug these numbers into here, right, what you're going to get is 3,000 times 4.31025. That's this number here. And that's going to give you 12,390.375. Hey there, in case you've noticed, I actually have a typo here. Of course, it's not 12,390, it should be 12,930. And if you picked it up, good for you, you're paying attention. Hello, welcome back. In this lecture, we continue our review of basic time value of money tools. This time we're going to look at how we find the future or present value of a stream of cash flows. All right, so what can we do with this? Well, alternatively, we can turn this problem on its head and ask what equal payments we would have to make, right, to get to a target value. So in other words, suppose we know the future value, we know the number of payments that we're going to make, and we know the constant interest rate, and we're looking what this cash flow or the equal payments should be. All right, so here's an example. Okay, so suppose you want to make sure that you have $1 million when you retire in 35 years. So that gives me the future value at t equals 35. Okay, that's our target. What even annual savings or payments would you have to make to get to your goal if you can earn 6% per year? Now, before we solve this problem, right, let me tell you from the start, obviously, yes, we're making a huge assumption by assuming that the interest rate is constant at 6% for the next 35 years. But imagine this is the average annual rate of return you expect to earn over the next 35 years. Okay? So we have the future value equal to 1 million, right? Now we know we're looking for the cash flow. We know the interest rate at 6%. We know the number of payments, 35, and we know the future value. Right? So we can use this general formula to solve for what the annual savings would have to be. Right? It would have to be $80,973.86. Okay, so let me just quickly recap what we've just done. We've been looking at annuities, right? Annuities that are a stream of cash flows with even number of with equal payments for a fixed period of time, and we just looked at how we find the future value of a annuity by this formula, right? Annuity compound factor R over R and N, and as a special case, we looked at the retirement problem. Where we know the future value, we know the constant interest rate, we know the number of payments, and we try to find what the equal payments should be. Okay, so now let's see how we find the present value of a stream of cash flows. Okay, so now suppose you will get, let's say, $2,000 for every year. Right? Let me draw the timeline. 1, 2, 3, 4, and suppose that you'll get this 2,000 for every year for 4 years. Okay, and what we're looking for is the present value. In other words, the question might be, well, how much would you be willing to pay to receive this annuity if, let's say, the opportunity cost of capital or the interest rate is 5% per year. Okay? Now, clearly, we can't just add them up and say, well, it's $8,000. No, right? Because they occur at different points in time. So what we need to do is we need to discount each cash flow, right, back to time 0, and then add them up. Okay, well, how do we do that? Well, remember, discounting involves this, right? So we can discount each cash flow individually for 2 periods, and so on and so forth. Let's say for the 4th period, right? And then add them up. Okay? Or again, we can come up with a shortcut, right? Let me factor this common 2,000 out. What do we have? Well, we would have 1.05, 1 over 1.05 squared, 1 over 1.05 cubed, and then finally 1.05 to the 4th, right? Okay, so again, right, this thing in the brackets is what we call this time the annuity discount factor, or annuity discount factor, where the parameters are the interest rate and the number of periods, right? So in general, the present value of an annuity where the equal payments are, let's say, $C, is going to be the annuity discount factor. So it's going to be the C times the annuity discount factor, where the interest rate is R and the number of periods is N. And what is this annuity discount factor? Well, it turns out to be, so what does this annuity discount factor do? Well, it sums the individual discount factors for each payment together over however number of periods, right? Well, it turns out to be 1 minus 1 plus R to the N divided by N. Okay, so in our example, what is it going to be? Well, it's going to be 2,000 times the annuity discount factor, where R is 5% and N is equal to 4. What can we do with this? Well, we can again turn this problem on its head, right? And look for the payments that are required if we know what the future, what the present value is. Okay, so we can sort of describe this as the loan problem. Okay, so here's an example. Suppose the purchase price of the car that you would like to buy today is $37,150. Right, so that's the present value. Right, $37,150 is the price of the car. Now you want to take out a loan. You're going to do 100% financing with a maturity of 60 months. Right, so there's going to be 60 payments. And let's say that the first loan payment will come in 1 month's time. And let's also assume that the interest rate is 4% compound per year, compounded monthly. Okay? The question is, what are your car payments? Right? What are your monthly car payments? Okay? Now, notice that this statement here, right, 4% per year compounded monthly. What does that mean? Well, what it tells us is what the interest rate per compounding period is. Right? So the interest rate is 4% per year, but it's being compounded every month. Right? So there's going to be 12 periods. So the rate per period is going to be 4% divided by 12, or 0.33%. Okay, so what do we have? Now we have an annuity, right, of 60 months, where N is 60. The monthly interest rate, or the relevant rate is the monthly interest rate, is 0.33% per month. Okay? We know what the present value is. This is how much we're borrowing, right? And we're looking for what the car payments will be, times annuity discount factor, right, where R is 0.33% and N is 60. Okay, and so if you solve this for the fixed equal cash flows, or the payments, your car payments are going to be $683.50. All right, well, that does it for this lecture, where we looked at how to find the present and future value of an annuity. Remember, what are annuities? Well, annuities are fixed equal cash flows for a specified number of periods, like in your mortgage payments, or in loan payments or bond payments. Hello, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about finding effective interest rates. Now, interest rates are typically compounded more often than once a year. For example, credit card payments or car loan payments or mortgage payments are compounded not yearly, but typically monthly. So, how do we adjust a given annual interest rate for different compounding periods? Or how do we compare annual interest rates to different annual interest rates that may have different compounding periods? Finally, what if the interest rate is being compounded every second instantaneously or continuously? How do we find the effective annual rate then? Okay, so let me go back to this example that we did from last time, right? So here's the example from last time where we found the monthly car loan payments that we would have to make. Now recall that this phrase that I pointed out last time as well, this phrase that interest rate is 4% per year, compounded monthly, tells us how often the interest rate is being compounded per year and what the interest rate is going to be per compounding period or per month in that case. Okay? So typically, interest rates are expressed as an annual percentage rate. Annual percentage rate. Or the APR. Right? For example, you may have seen the APR on a credit card offer or your credit card statement. Okay? Now, APR, or the annual percentage rate, is not the effective interest rate that we pay, right? This is just the stated annual percentage rate. Now, what we need to do is we need to adjust this to find the effective annual rate. Okay, so let's do an example. Suppose the stated interest rate is 4% per year, compounded monthly. Right? So the stated annual rate, or the APR, the annual percentage rate, let's say, is 4% per year, compounded monthly. Again, this is not the actual rate that we're going to end up paying, right? This is just a way to state, to express the rate per year. Now let's find the effective annual rate. Well, first we start by finding what the rate per compounding period is. Okay, so let me call this X, right? The stated annual rate is 4%. Okay, now let's think about how many times this is going to compound per year. Well, it's being compounded monthly, and there are 12 months in a year, so it's going to compound 12 times. Right? So what is the rate per period? Well, it's going to be 4% divided by 12 point per month. Just like we did last time. Now let's find the effective annual rate. Right? So what we're doing is, right, I want to find the effective rate per year if the interest rate is being compounded every month. Right? So you can think of this the following way. Let's call the effective annual rate RA. Okay, so what am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for this one interest rate that's going to be compounding once, such that, right, I'm getting the same interest rate over 12 months. All right, so where M is how many times it's being compounded. X is the stated annual rate. Or in other words, 1 plus APR divided by M to the M minus 1. Okay, so what is the effective annual rate in our example? Well, it's going to be 1.0033 to the 12th minus 1. And so it's going to be 4.032%. Right, so the stated annual rate was 4% per year, compounded monthly. Right, that gave us 0.33% per month that is being compounded every month. Right, so what is the effective annual rate over the year? Well, it's obviously it's going to be a little higher than 4%. It turns out to be 4.032%. Now let's find other effective interest rates. Okay, so let's find, for example, let's find the 2-month effective rate. What would that be? Well, right, what is the 2-month effective rate? Well, again, this is the per month rate, 0.033 to the second minus 1. Right? Why 2? Well, because I am computing the 2-month effective rate. And what is that going to be? Well, that's going to be 0.6611%. What if we wanted to find the effective 3-month rate? The 3-month effective rate. Same thing, right? I'm going to take the per period rate, 1.033 to the third minus 1, and that's going to give us 0.9933%. What about the effective 6-month rate? Right, now how many times is it going to compound? Well, it's going to compound 6 times to the 6 minus 1. So that's going to give me 1.9964%. Okay, we can even find an effective rate over a period that is greater than a year. Let's find the effective 18-month rate. Or if you want to express it as our 1.5 year, right? What is that? Well, it's going to compound 18 times over that period. So it's going to be 1.0033 to the 18th minus 1. And that's going to give us 6.1096%. Now let's do another example. What if we have an interest rate of 6% per year compounded semi-annually? The APR is 6% per year compounded semi-annually. So what is the per period rate? Well, it's being compounded every 6 months. So the 6-month rate, right, is simply 6% divided by 2. or 3%. What is the effective annual rate? Well, it's going to compound twice because it's being compounded semi-annually, right? It's going to be 1.03 squared minus 1. In other words, that's going to give me 6.09%. We can still find other effective rates. Let's, for example, let's find the 3-month effective rate. Right? Well, think about it. What we're really looking for is a rate, right, such that when it's compounded over 6 months, in other words, twice, right, that it will give us the same rate as the 6-month rate, which is 3%. Right? So if I solve for the effective 3-month rate, I'm going to find 1.4889%. Okay? What about the 2-year effective rate? All right, so that's now we're looking at effective 2-year effective rate. Or you can think of that as the 24-month rate. Right? Now remember, the interest rate is being compounded every 6 months. So how many times is it going to compound? Well, it's going to compound 4 times. 1.03 to the 4th minus 1. So we are compounding the 6-month rate for 4 periods to find the effective 24-month rate, which is going to give us, well, you can solve that. All right. What about the effective 15-month rate? Well, again, the same concept, right? How many times am I going to, how many times is this going to compound over the 15-month period? Well, it's going to compound 15 divided by 6 times minus 1. Right? And that's going to give us the effective 15-month rate. The effective rate changes, obviously, right? You've seen the examples with how many times the interest rate is being compounded, right? What if the interest rate is being compounded continuously, right? Every instant. Let's suppose that, again, let's let x be the stated annual rate, or the APR, if you will, right? Now, when we find the effect, when we find the per period rate, right? We said R is going to be x divided by m, right? And then the effective annual rate we find by 1 plus R to the m. Right? Now, what does it mean to compound continuously or every instant? Well, it essentially means, right, we're letting this m get very large. Right? So because we're chopping it up into very small pieces. Or in other words, making this, the number of times it gets compounded, to be very, very many times. Right? Well, turns out, as m gets very large, right, let's call RC the continuously compounded rate. right? Turns out that e to the x turns out to be 1 plus the RC. Right, so in our example, if we let interest rate to compound 6% per year, compound it continuously, that is equivalent to e to the 0.006, or if that's going to give us 6.183%. Oops. Again, I have a little typo here. The continuously compounded rate should be equal to e to the 0.06 minus 1, which is equal to 6.183%. So if you got that, good for you. All right, I know this was a lot of material. All right, so in this lecture, you learned the difference between stated interest rate and effective rates, how to convert an annual percentage rate to an effective rate, right, for different periods. Also, you learned how to compute the continuously compounded rate given the annual stated rate. Hello, welcome back. I hope you're enjoying this mini review of basic time value of money tools. So far, we've looked at how we find the present value and the future value of a single cash flow, of a stream of cash flows. We looked at annuities with fixed even cash flows for a specified number of periods. For example, coupon-paying bonds are an example of annuities. So today, we're going to look at perpetuities. And we're also going to revisit annuities and see how we incorporate growth. Okay, so let's start with perpetuities. What is a perpetuity? Well, perpetuity is a series of equal payments, of fixed payments that go on forever, indefinitely. Right, so let me draw the timeline. All right, so what is a perpetuity? Well, imagine you get a cash flow, a constant cash flow, every period going into the future forever. Right? So why is this relevant? Where do we see examples of perpetuities? Well, just like coupon-paying bonds are examples of annuities, a natural example of a perpetuity is a dividend-paying stock, right? A dividend-paying stock does not have an end point or a maturity, right? It just keeps paying, or it's assumed to live, the company is assumed to live forever, so the payments are considered to go on forever. Okay, so let's do an example. How much would you be willing to pay for an opportunity to get paid $1,000 per year forever if the interest rate is 10% per year? Right, so here's the perpetuity that we're thinking about. Okay, so you're promised $1,000 every year going into the future forever, and so on and so forth. Right? And suppose the interest rate is 10%. Right? How much would you be willing to receive, right, this stream of cash flows? In other words, we're looking for the present value. Right? So if this was a dividend-paying stock, it would be, if the dividends were $1,000, how much would you be willing to pay for this stock, for example? right? Well, of course, one way to look at this problem is to try to discount each cash flow back to time 0, right? But I'm afraid you'd be at it forever because this cash flow, this stream goes on forever, right? There is a shortcut. Unfortunately, fortunately, we don't have to go discount every single cash flow forever. In fact, the present value of this perpetuity is simply going to be the equal fixed cash flow divided by the interest rate or the opportunity cost of capital. So in this case, it's going to be $1,000 divided by 0.10. So this would be $10,000, right? And that should make sense, right? Because if imagine you deposited $10,000 in a bank account that pays 10%, right? You'd be able to withdraw $1,000 every year and never deplete the account, basically. Okay? Now, let's think of a scenario where the payments are growing at a constant growth rate G. Right? Let's say that this is the constant growth rate. Right? Let's suppose that the payments are growing at 5%. Let's say that G is 5%. Right? So in other words, now the first payment is you get 1,000. Then the next period is going to be 1,000 times 1.05. Right? The next period is going to be 1.05 squared, and so on and so forth. But it's going to keep growing. Right? What is the present value of this stream of cash flow, of this growing perpetuity? Right? Again, one way would be to try to discount it individually. Of course, that's impossible because this is a perpetuity. The cash flows go on forever. There is a shortcut. Turns out that the present value of a growing perpetuity is simply the fixed payment, the first fixed payment, right, divided by R minus G. Or in our example, it's going to be $1,000 divided by 0.10, the interest rate, minus 0.05. Or, in other words, is going to be $20,000. Okay? So we just looked at how we value perpetuities, right, which are fixed cash flows that go into the future forever, right? Periodic, it's a series of periodic fixed cash flows that go on into the future, and the present value of such a cash flow stream is simply going to be C over R. Or if it's growing at a constant growth rate G, then we have C R minus G. We already looked at annuities, right? How do we incorporate the growth into annuities, right? So let's think of how we do that in the context of annuities. For example, you think your salary is going to start at $90,000 next year, and it's going to grow by 5% over the next 5 years. What is the present value of your future salary today if the interest rate is 8% per year? So what am I looking at? I'm looking at, here's the cash flow that we're thinking about. Okay, so Your salary is going to start at 90,000, right? And then you expect it to grow for at 5% every year for the next 5 years, right? So here is going to be 90,000 times 1.05. Then it's going to grow to 90,000 1.05 squared, and so on and so forth. Right? Well, fortunately, one way, of course, we can find the present value is to discount these individually, which is not so bad, right? Back to 0. Right? Alternatively, we can adjust the annuity discount factor and the annuity compound factor that we had from before for the growth rate. Okay? Well, turns out the annuity compound factor is simply 1 plus r to the n minus 1 plus g to the n divided by r minus g. What is the annuity discount factor? Well, that's going to be 1 minus, let me write it this way, 1 plus r to the n divided by 1 plus g to the n divided by r minus g. Stop, freeze frame. Okay, some of you may have noticed the typo here. I clearly mixed up the r and the g in the numerator of the annuity discount factor expression. Of course, the correct formula should read 1 minus 1 plus g to the n over 1 plus r to the n, all divided by r minus g. Sorry about the confusion, guys. Carry on. Okay, so going back to our problem here, right? What is the present value of your future salary if it starts at 90,000 and is going to grow over 5 years at 5%, and the interest rate is 8%, right? We can use the annuity discount factor with the growth, so that's going to be 90,000 times the annuity discount factor, where r is 8%, n is 5, and g is 5%. And you just plug in the numbers. Okay? All right, so in this lecture, we looked at perpetuities. We looked at the case of a growing perpetuity, and we also looked at how we incorporate growth in annuities. In this module, we reviewed the very basic tools of finance, time value of money tools. Most of finance is about moving cash flows across time, and that's what these tools allow us to do. You learn how to discount to find the present value of a cash flow in the future. You learn how to compound to find the future value of a cash flow today. You learn the difference between APR, the annual percentage rate, and an effective interest rate, and how to find the effective interest rate with different compounding periods. We then apply these tools to find the future and present value of streams of cash flows, such as annuities. Annuities are streams of periodic equal cash flows that last for a fixed number of periods. And there are lots of examples of annuities around us, like mortgage payments, car loans, and valuing annuities is going to be the main tool that we're going to use in finding the value of bonds in the next module. Understanding annuities is really useful because a lot of practical problems, like saving for retirement or finding loan payments, are simply applications of annuities. You also learned about perpetuities, which are infinite streams of equal periodic cash flows. You learn how to find the present value of a perpetuity. And again, this is what we're going to use to find the value of a dividend-paying share of stock in the future. And you also learn how to deal with what growing cash flows if they grow at a constant rate in the case of growing perpetuities. Now, I want to point out that while I illustrated how you would do these computations using simple pen and paper with the formulas, of course it's much easier to use a financial calculator or Excel functions to do these computations. However, I must emphasize how important it is to understand these tools at the elementary level, even if you end up using a financial calculator to actually do these computations. I hope you enjoyed this brief review of the main toolbox in finance. Hello, I'm Dr. O, and I would like to welcome you back to the second module of Global Financial Markets and Assets. In the previous module, I outlined the topics and the organization of this course, as well as the investment management specialization, which this course is a part of. One thing you probably heard me say in the last module is that asset allocation is about finding the right mix of assets for a given investor. This requires, on one hand, understanding of the needs and the constraints of the investor, and we will devote an entire future course to this topic later on. On the other hand, it also requires an understanding of the economic environment, the financial markets, and the financial instruments available to the investor. So in this module, we focus on this. My goal in this module is to familiarize you with the institutional features of financial markets. We will look at the wide range of financial instruments available and also understand the roles played by various participants in these markets. Basically, in this module, I hope you will get to see the big picture of the entire financial system and how it comes together. Global markets have grown dramatically over the last 30, 40 years. Several new market economies have emerged. There is greater globalization and integration of markets. It is now much easier for capital to flow across borders. There have been incredible advances in technology and financial innovation, leading to the introduction of new products such as ETFs, indexation, and several others. And despite the recent financial crisis, the value of the world's financial assets, that is the total value of global stock and debt outstanding, was a staggering $225 trillion at the end of 2012. And every day we hear about financial markets and their performance in the news. It feels like our fortunes are indexed to financial markets. But let's just stop for a minute. Why do we need financial markets? What role do they really serve? Peter Bernstein, a famous American financial historian and economist, once said, "Financial markets are a kind of time machine that allows selling investors to compress the future into the present and buying investors to stretch the present into the future." I like this quote a lot because it's a great way of summarizing what financial markets do. Think about it. Compress the future into the present and stretch the present into the future. So what does this mean? What do financial markets do? Well, what they do is help direct the flow of savings and investment in the economy from the suppliers of capital to the users of capital. This facilitates the allocation and deployment of scarce resources across time and space in the economy. On one hand, they enable individuals like you and me to save for retirement, afford to buy homes, or finance our education. On the other hand, they help entrepreneurs fund their businesses, grow their businesses, and develop new products and technologies. Capital markets also enable, for example, state and local governments to use the proceeds from issuing municipal bonds to construct roads, schools, and other public facilities. Financial markets make all of this possible. Let me give you an example that illustrates all the different functions that financial markets provide in an economy. Let's consider the entrepreneur Fred. Fred has just developed a design for a new truck that extracts rocks from a quarry far better than any existing trucks. Manufacturing this new design of trucks, however, requires an intricate assembly line with very highly specialized labor and capital. So he needs to obtain highly specialized labor, and he needs capital. Now, it would be very, very costly to try to pay his workers and suppliers with barter exchange. Thankfully, we do not need to transact in barter exchange anymore. The financial system, which also includes money in the form of currency and checks, provides a medium for exchange. It provides a mechanism to clear and settle payments and facilitate transactions so that Fred can pay his workers and get the highly specialized labor he needs. Production also requires capital. Fred needs financing for the plants and machinery, etc. Now, even if Fred had the savings, he might not want to put all of his savings into this one risky investment. He might want to keep his savings for some unexpected future event that might happen in the future. Moreover, he may be reluctant to tie up all of his savings in this one truck project, which might or might not yield any profits for a long time. So his distaste for risk and desire for liquidity leave him in need of a mechanism that will provide him with the liquidity he needs and with the ability to diversify and share risk with other investors in order to start his project. So he turns to financial markets to find the investors who will fund his project. To obtain the outside funding he needs, however, potential investors who are willing to put money into Fred's business will of course require some information about the truck design, about Fred's ability to implement the design, and whether or not there is sufficient demand for better quarry trucks in the first place. In other words, investors will need to assess the future prospects of this project and come up with a valuation for Fred's business. Now, finally, to finance Fred's idea, these investors must also have the confidence that Fred will not steal the funds or run the plant poorly or misrepresent his profits. In other words, the financial contracts that they will get in exchange for financing Fred's project must have the right governance features to provide this confidence. This little example highlights several functions that a financial system provides. The mix of different financial contracts, price discovery, diversification of risk. So let me summarize once again what financial markets do. They basically help facilitate transactions, smooth consumption over time and space, allow pooling of resources and risk, aggregate diverse information to facilitate price discovery, and deal with agency problems that are caused by information asymmetry. Now we have this backdrop of the various roles of financial markets. We start out in this module with a look at different financial instruments and asset classes. New financial instruments aren't created simply because someone on Wall Street thinks that it would be fun to introduce another instrument with more bells and whistles. The demand for new instruments is driven by the needs of borrowers and investors based on their financing needs, investment objectives, or regulatory constraints, or maybe tax considerations. So we'll talk about financial instruments first, and then after we have looked at these instruments, we will finish this module with a discussion of various participants in the market and their roles in financial markets. So let's have fun. Hello, welcome back. In this lecture, I will introduce you to the important features of broad types of financial securities. we will tour a wide range of financial instruments organized mainly according to asset classes, moving from traditional to what are called alternative asset classes. But before we dive into various types of financial assets, let me ask you this. What is a financial asset, and how is it different from a real asset? Well, financial assets are essentially claims. They may be sometimes a piece of paper or sometimes a computer entry, but they are basically claims to future cash flows, usually generated by real assets. Now, what are real assets? Well, they are what produce the goods and services in the economy. They are, for example, buildings, equipment, machines, land, etc. For example, if we can own an auto plant, which is a real asset, we can own shares in Ford and share the income generated by the production of cars by Ford. So in other words, while real assets generate the income in the economy, financial assets determine the allocation of this income among investors. As we discussed previously, individuals can choose between consuming their wealth today or investing for the future. Now, if we choose to invest, then we can invest our wealth in financial assets by purchasing various securities. When we buy these securities from companies, firms in turn use this money to pay for real assets such as plant, equipment, etc. And investors' returns on securities ultimately come from this income generated by the real assets that are financed by the financial securities. Now, here are some examples of financial assets. Let's start by the first one, a bond issued by the U.S. Department of Treasury, which is the issuer in this case. The Treasury, the U.S. government, is the issuer, and it agrees to pay the investor, the owner of the bond, interest until the bond matures, and at maturity, the principal, in other words, the amount borrowed. Similarly, in the case of Apple, or in the case of a bond issued by the state of California. These are all fixed income securities with known fixed cash flows. Now, in the case of a bond that is issued by the Greek government, the cash payments are also fixed and known if the Greek government doesn't default. But the cash payments may be denominated in euros. So from the U.S. investor's point of view, the dollar cash amount may not be certain, as it will depend on the exchange rate at the time of the payment. A home mortgage loan is also an example of a fixed income security. This time, the bank is the investor and has lent funds to an individual. And the loan agreement specifies a schedule of payments to the bank. Now, a share of common stock issued by Microsoft is an example of an equity security, and it entitles the investor to dividend payments if Microsoft pays any dividends. It also entitles the investor to a claim on the pro rata share of the residual value of the company if it is ever liquidated. The same applies to the cash payments on the common stock issued by Honda Motor Company. However, again, the dividend payments are denominated in Japanese yen, and therefore, from a U.S. investor's point of view, it is subject to uncertainty depending on the exchange rate. Now, there are several ways of classifying financial markets and instruments. One way is the type of the financial claim. The claims of a financial instrument can either be fixed, a fixed amount, or it could be residual claim. Those that have fixed cash flow payments are called debt instruments, and they are traded in the debt market or the fixed income market. So in the previous list of examples we had, treasury bonds or bonds issued by Apple or the state of California, the mortgage loan, they were all examples of fixed income securities. Financial assets with a residual claim are called equity instruments and are traded in the equity or stock market. Now, Ford stock and Honda stock in the previous example were examples of equity securities. Preferred stock is a kind of hybrid instrument because it is an equity instrument with equity claims, but it entitles the investor to receive a fixed cash flow, so it has also debt features. Alternatively, we can classify financial markets and instruments by the maturity of the claims. For example, financial assets with short-term maturity are called money market instruments. And the traditional cutoff between short-term and long-term is 1 year. So all instruments less than 1 year maturity belong to the money market. A financial asset with a maturity of more than 1 year is part of the capital market. Since equity is perpetual, they belong to the capital market. So to summarize, fixed income securities are financial claims that have a predetermined stream of cash flows in the future. Those that have maturities less than 1 year are traded in the money market, and long-term fixed income securities are traded in the debt market. Equity securities, on the other hand, are residual cash flow claims, and they represent ownership in a corporation. Now, another class of securities that I haven't talked about yet, but we will see, are derivative securities. Derivative securities, as the name suggests, are contracts that derive their value from the price of the underlying financial assets. So here's a roadmap of what's coming. In the next lecture, you will learn about money market instruments, which are short-term fixed income securities. Then we will turn our focus to long-term debt instruments. Then we'll talk about equity instruments and derivative instruments. Finally, we will learn about what are called alternative asset classes in today's investment world. Let's now look at each category more closely. Hello, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to review the basic principles of valuing a financial asset. So to value any financial asset, we need two ingredients. First, we need the promised to value any financial asset. We need the promised or the expected cash flows. Promised or expected cash flows. Two, we need an appropriately risk-adjusted discount rate. Risk-adjusted discount rate, R. Then, to find the value of any financial asset, all we have to do is basically discount the cash flows, the promised or the expected cash flows, at the appropriately risk-adjusted discount rate. And that's really all there is to it. So first, identify the cash flows, find the risk-adjusted discount rate, and then discount the cash flows back to today to find the value of any financial asset today. Right? It sounds simple. Of course, it's tricky to find what the cash flows are, and sometimes tricky to find what the risk-adjusted discount rate is. Okay? So in this lecture, we're going to apply this valuation technique to valuing bonds. We're going to learn how to find the value of bonds. Okay? We're going to look at some key features of bonds. How do we describe a bond? What are the key cash flows? And then we're going to see how we can value a bond, that is, find the price of a bond. We'll look at the the simplest case first. We'll look at the case of zero coupon bonds. And then we're going to look at how we value coupon bonds, which typically most corporate bonds are. Okay? And finally, you're going to learn how to interpret the yield on a bond and how to compute it. Okay? All right, so what is a bond? Well, a bond is a fixed income instrument. Basically, it's an IOU, a note that promises to make specified future cash flows. Right? So putting default aside for a moment, in this case, the promise and the expected cash flows are the same. Right? So governments, the US Treasury, corporations issue bonds to borrow from investors. Bonds have typically two cash flows. Right? First, they have the principal or the face value at maturity. Right? This is the face value paid at maturity. The face value is also called the par value, and it's typically $1,000 for corporate bonds in the US. Okay? Second, a bond may also make periodic payments that are called coupons. Right? The coupons are specified by the coupon rate, which is expressed as a percentage of the face value. So for example, a coupon rate of 5% means that the bond, let's say the face value is 1,000, the bond will make 1,000 times 5%, $50 periodically, annually, in coupon payments. Right? Typically, the coupon payments will be made semi-annually, so that each coupon will, in fact, be $25, right? Semi-annually. Now, notice that the coupon rate is not the rate of the return on the bond or the interest rate of the bond, right? It's just a way to tell us what these cash flows are. Okay? All right, so now let's begin valuing bonds with the simplest case of the zero coupon bond. Well, these are the simplest financial assets or bonds